Welcome everybody to this Slips, Trips and Falls Ask Me Anything open Q&A session. Great to see you all here today. There are some people with me on the Zoom, and we've also got this going onto various other channels. It's going live on LinkedIn. It is going live on Twitter or X. It's going live into a couple of Facebook groups, and it's going live on YouTube as well. So lots and lots of places to join the discussion today. So I am going to answer any questions you've got today about slips, trips, and falls. What I've done is I've taken the liberty of preparing a number of questions, pre-preparing a number of questions, just to give you the opportunity of thinking of which questions you've got and posing those. So let's start. Just fire into the chat, whichever channel you're watching this on. Give me a number between 1 and 9 or a color, and whatever we get, I will answer that question. 1 to 9. Let me know in the comments. Now I'm going to have to look on all these different places. Okay, so somebody has asked for number 3. So let's start with number 3. Oh, this is a good question. How can I tell if I have a slip or a trip risk? So we did a research project last year, which we're redoing this year, actually, called The State of Safety. And we asked the question of people, is slips a relevant risk to your business? Is trips a relevant risk to your business? And 85% of businesses said that slips was a relevant risk to them, either to their staff or their customers or whatever it might be. And trips was a little bit less. I can't tell you who said trips or if they didn't say slips and vice versa, but the overall abiding message is that slips and trips are a relevant risk to the vast majority of businesses. So do you have the risk? You probably do. How do you understand that risk, I guess, is another question entirely. And there are different things you need to look at clearly between slips and trips, because although we often bundle them together, and I've kind of bundled them together in this session, obviously, they're actually very different things. So trips are much more straightforward to look to solve. They are things that you can more readily spot, and there are things around trips that you can do relatively easily to address any hazards that you find. With slips, it's a little bit more complicated. There is quite a lot more breadth and depth to the subject, and it's harder to spot all of the risks in the same way, and you need to have a bit of science and use a bit of measurement and quantification of slip risks. So it's possible to spot them. How can you tell if you've got the risk? You probably do. How can you look into it? What I suggest you do is dig into some of this content we've been producing this month for excuse me, for Sliptember, and that will give you some more guidance. So let me know, type into the chat wherever you are if you've got any specific questions. If not, someone's asked for number 4, so I'm going to answer number 4, but just fire any questions you've got into the chat, whichever channel you're on, and I'm trying to monitor all these channels at the same time as as answering the questions. So question 4 was, how large should our entrance matting be? If it's not big enough, what should we do? Are temporary mats useful? This is a great question. Excuse me, just getting over a bit of a cough. Let me just have a sip of my water. So most buildings have entrance matting. Not all buildings, but most buildings do. What I can tell you about entrance matting is that most of the time it's too small. So the HSE did some guidance with the Entrance Flooring Association a few years ago. And broadly speaking, they said that for a low peak traffic flow of people going through your entrance, which was about 85 people per hour, you should have 1 to 2 meters of fixed matting. And then that would increase so that if you had a peak traffic flow of 800 people, you should have 8 to 10 meters of matting. Now, think about buildings that you have visited or seen. How common is it that they have anywhere near 8 to 10 meters of entrance matting? Very, very uncommon. So most buildings have, 50 centimeters to a meter. The answer is that you probably need more than you've got. The best way to tell about matting being effective is standing inside on a wet day. So if it's raining and you stand inside and you can see liquid on the floor beyond the matting, then that's a very good sign that your entrance matting is probably not working for you. That could be due to its size, and in my experience, a lot of the challenge is about size. But it could also be a couple of other factors. So there is the material of matting that's used. If you have a natural material, then it's going to be typically better at absorbing contamination, but it requires more maintenance and isn't quite as long lasting. If you've got a man-made material, it's more hard wearing, more durable, longer lasting, but typically less effective at capturing the contamination. And then maintenance is a really key thing as well. As I go around the country and visit high footfall areas like supermarkets, for example, I always have a look at the matting, as you can probably expect, as I walk inside. And what I tend to see is that it's a bit dirty. It might have chewing gum in it, be sort of clogged up. Anything like that is reducing the efficacy of the matting. So we need to think about, is it big enough? Are we looking after it properly? Do we understand what material it is, and are we maintaining that correctly or not? Are temporary mats useful? Well, again, HSE has issued guidance that temporary mats should be temporary. What often happens is that temporary mats become permanent, or at least semi-permanent. So temporary mats shouldn't be put out every time it rains, because that isn't a temporary solution, because raining is a regular, foreseeable risk. And so you should be doing something over and above just putting out some temporary mats if it starts to rain. What I would suggest is the principle of a mat, obviously, is to keep a floor from getting contaminated or wet. And therefore you can have a floor that is slippery because it's not getting contaminated or wet, and therefore it doesn't present a slip risk. If the matting isn't working for you, then you need to start looking at the floor, because that is more of a permanent, long-term solution than putting out temporary mats, because temporary matting is reliant upon people and humans doing what they're supposed to do and following procedures, which it doesn't always happen, should we say. Good stuff. Fire in any questions to the chat. I'm just going to have a quick look here and see where we're up to with questions. It's quite difficult actually looking at all these different channels. Perhaps next time I won't have quite as many things going when I do one of these Q&A sessions. Or let me know, just fire in a number or a colour and I can answer the next question. Somebody's asked for question 8, so let's have a look at that. Nice pink one. Are yellow wet floor signs useful or not? How and when should these be used? So this is a big bugbear of mine, these yellow signs. They are often put out because people don't really understand what they should be used for. They seem to be put out with a view that this is kind of protecting us or protecting me as the person who's put them out from any repercussions if something bad happens. There was a case in 2015 where, and I've talked about this before, where a gentleman called Stanley May was in a Co-op store in Truro in Cornwall. There was a leaking chiller in the supermarket and a puddle of water on the floor, and a yellow sign was out in the middle of the puddle, close to where the chiller was leaking. And tragically, he slipped, banged his head, and passed away. CCTV footage exists. It's very clear that a yellow sign was out. The yellow sign did not stop him from slipping. It did not stop him from falling. It did not stop him from banging his head. It didn't stop his death, and it didn't stop the Co-op being fined by Cornwall Council after being found guilty of a breach of the law, fined £400,000. And actually, as the council summed up the case after the prosecution went through, they said, and I'm paraphrasing, it's not the exact terminology, this case should serve as a warning to that signage alone is not an adequate control. Proactive measures must be taken to prevent floors becoming slippery or to preclude public access. What does that mean in simple terms? It means that the sign doesn't save you like people think that it does. You either need to make sure that your floors are, if they're wet or contaminated, not unsafe in that condition. In other words, if you have a slip-resistant floor and it's wet, then that's fine because it's safe to use when it's wet. Or you need to stop people from being able to walk upon that floor and therefore prevent that risk from happening. So you're either preventing the risk by making the floor safe to use when it's wet or contaminated, or you're preventing the risk by stopping anyone from walking on that floor because it's unsafe to walk upon when it's wet or contaminated. So signs as they are typically used are not useful because they don't typically stop people from doing things, and they don't actually help you to defend yourself, as this case shows, in the event of something bad happening. When should they be used? There are two very specific scenarios where yellow signs should be used. One is during pre-planned cleaning. So typically, if you are cleaning a floor, you are introducing liquid, water, and potentially some cleaning chemical onto that floor. And therefore, you are making that floor become more slippery than it would have been had you not been cleaning it. So you should absolutely use yellow signs during the cleaning process that you had planned to undertake, and the sign should then be removed once you have dried the floor, which should be the last part of that cleaning process. The second time you should use a yellow wet floor sign is immediately after a spillage, whilst you're dealing with that spillage. And then again, once you have dealt with the spillage by removing the contaminant and then drying the floor, the yellow sign should be removed. Those are the only 2 times you should use a yellow sign. Other than that, you should not be using them. If you've got water ingress from outside, you shouldn't be using a yellow sign. You should be, as the Cornwall Council said, preventing the floor from being used, preventing people from walking on that floor whilst it's in that unsafe condition, or you should be making sure that the floor isn't slippery by having a floor, either by putting in a floor or treating the floor or whatever it might be to make it safe. You shouldn't be just plonking a sign out and hoping for the best, which sadly is what a lot of people do. Question here, what's my view on tenants, especially residential buildings, who install or provide footmats at the door within the common area? That's a good question. So the difficulty there is that the common areas are probably under the control of a duty holder of some kind, the managing agent or the owner or whoever it might be. And so if somebody is introducing something into those areas, then if you allow that to be there, then that becomes kind of your problem because you've allowed it to transpire. Obviously, if you're putting in sort of temporary mats like these foot mats and stuff, and they're sitting and protruding above the surface, that could have a benefit from the perspective of drying floors and removing contamination from the feet, but it could also have a risk associated to it because you're introducing a bit of a trip hazard as well. So I would say that if it's felt that those things are needed, that you as the duty holder should probably be the one to come up with a solution for that rather than allowing the tenants to do it. So I'd be asking them or telling them, depending on how you want to go about it, not to do that. And instead I'd be thinking about what I could do in a more permanent way that would achieve the same objective of drying off the feet and preventing contamination, but would not introduce the risk of trips. Keep the questions coming in the comments, guys, as questions are coming in. And I will answer them as we go. So I have been asked by Adam to answer number 9. Okay. Are these problems that we can solve ourselves with simple changes? So I kind of alluded to this earlier, that there's a difference between trips and slips. So we often bundle slips and trips and falls together into one category. And then a lot of people, even so-called experts on this subject, will talk about it's simple to solve these problems. Now, I fundamentally disagree with that perspective because I don't believe it's actually simple to solve slip problems in the real world. I think that it requires a lot more depth than that to do it properly. However, with trips, it absolutely is simple to solve those. It's about 4 things, really. And predominantly it's about being able to spot hazards and actually then dealing with them and not walking by. So there are absolutely things you can go away and do on both slips and trips to reduce the risk. When it comes to kind of fully solving that problem, then trips is more straightforward to do, more simple to do, more possible to do. But less So for slips where you do need, in my experience, a bit more help from third parties, potentially, when it comes to things like footwear standards, efficacy of cleaning regimes, measuring slip resistance of flooring, quantifying the effectiveness of cleaning, and so on and so forth. There's a bit more science to it, so it's a little bit more difficult to solve yourself. Question here: how can you manage slip hazards created by dogs in a pet-friendly store? Oh, no, that's a question that doesn't come up very often. I don't think I've ever been asked that before. I can't really tell you how to stop a dog from slipping over, because the biomechanics of dogs and humans are pretty different, obviously. But what I'm assuming you mean by that are things like dogs are probably bringing in contamination, or we're creating contamination by putting drinking bowls out and things like that. So I always suggest that people look at slips in a zonal way. If you look at the majority of buildings, it's probably about 5% of the floor areas that are prone for a slip to happen. In other words, they are the highest traffic areas where the floor is most likely to get wet or otherwise contaminated. And 95%, it's less likely that a slip would happen. So if you're a pet-friendly store and you're putting in some food or some water bowls or whatever, you're kind of extending the scope of that zone. So you're introducing risk, and therefore you need to maybe take a slightly different approach, or be looking in more detail at different areas of the store than you might otherwise be. Sorry, I think I'm going to sneeze. I just muted it, but I didn't sneeze in the end. Think about, obviously, the flooring material, because if you've got a water bowl and water's therefore going to be dripped on the floor, realistically, you can't keep it dry. So you need to think about the floor being safe in its intended use, which, if you've introduced a water bowl, is wet. It's very similar to washrooms in offices or shopping centres or whatever. We often find floor surfaces that appear to be designed for dry areas, but actually you've got a wet area there that is constantly going to get wet, and it's impossible to keep it dry. So you need to be thinking about that. So I'd probably be thinking mostly about introducing some kind of zonal system of slightly more slip resistant floors around any areas where you were going to put bowls for dogs to drink from. Question here about a scenario where you might have a leaking ceiling from rainfall, which would be unexpected, whilst awaiting a contractor to repair or survey. Well, let's go back, Shirley, to the principles of Cornwall Council after that Co-op case. Floors should be either not slippery, or access from them should be precluded. So in that scenario, it's an unexpected risk, but you're aware of the risk because you've called for an engineer to come. I would be suggesting that if you know the slip resistance of your floor and you've got a current and up-to-date slip safety certificate which says that the floor is safe when it's wet, then that's fine and it could be used. If, however, you don't have that, I would be wanting to prevent people from accessing that space, because although it's an unexpected thing, you are aware of it, and if you've called and you're waiting for somebody to come and deal with it, I would then be saying, you know that risk is there, and therefore you should be dealing with it in the correct way. So I would be barriering that area off and stopping people from using it, unless if it's a very small leak and you're able to keep the floor reliably dry, then of course that's another thing. If the floor is clean and dry, then it's not going to present a slip risk. Whereas if the water is kind of coming down in floods from the ceiling and spreading everywhere, I'd be closing that area off and stopping people from walking on it. I think that's the most pragmatic thing to do there. Somebody's asked about number 7. How can we get buy-in from the business to take slips and trips more seriously? So this is a question I get asked a lot, because the perception of slips and trips is that they're not very serious, and there are lots of reasons for that perception. The data would suggest otherwise, from the perspective that the overall leading cause of RIDDORs is slips, trips, and falls. The overall leading cause of insurance claims is slips, trips, and falls. So the leading cause of hospitalisation is slips, trips, and falls. So all the data, when you bundle it together, shows that this is a massive problem. But one of the drivers of the perception challenges is that even though it is a big, massive problem over here, if you divide the number of buildings in the UK, let's say, by the number of incidents that happen, then the average building has well under 1 incident per year. So it's a problem that is big, but it's very thinly spread. So it's quite easy, or not easy, but it's understandable how people can believe that they perhaps don't have a problem, or they don't have that big a problem, because they haven't had one of these accidents, and therefore they perceive they don't have a problem at all or a risk at all. So you can see how the logic can work, that people would perceive these as not being that serious. What I would try to do is use some of the logic and the data to explain the size and scope of the problem, but also think about the emotive side, the stories, the case studies, the examples. And the reality is that nobody wants somebody to be hurt on their watch. Nobody wants to be called into court to have to explain themselves after somebody got hurt on their watch. So we all kind of want the same thing, even if we're not working in safety. None of us want to be responsible for someone else getting hurt. So we need to play up a bit more of that emotive side, I would say, as a way to kind of influence people, but also bring in the right kinds of facts and figures. Something else that could work quite well is, if you're in a larger organization, this particularly can work well, is have a word with your insurance company and explore opportunities to partner up with them, because insurers, because they aggregate all of these claims costs, they see the size and scope of this problem more so than individual businesses might do. And if you are an organization of a decent size, and you're therefore paying a pretty decent insurance premium each year, there could be an opportunity for what's called an insurance risk management bursary, where the insurance company may fund some activity around slips and trips risk mitigation, and/or there could be an opportunity, by demonstrating your proactivity and your openness and willingness to reduce risk in this area, to see your premium reduced. I remember supporting a property owner, this was probably 10 years ago now, with about 20 or 30 shopping centres and 20 or 30 commercial office type buildings. And their insurance company funded us to do a survey of their whole estate and a report and recommendations and so on. So they put their hand in their pocket for that. But they also gave the organisation an immediate discount on their premium in the following year, just because they were looking into this issue and taking it more seriously than another company may have done. So it can pay to look at this problem from an insurance perspective, and obviously if you can have that third-party validation, that's going to be quite powerful when it comes to engaging with the business. And by the business here, I'm assuming people are thinking mostly about the board. Yeah. Okay, question here about floor matting. There's an incident that I posted recently about a fatality, yes, which I did, and I spoke about that a minute ago as well. I attended a similar store in a small village in Hampshire, and their matting was around a square metre. With one step, I passed the matting, and all of a sudden I started slipping. Pointed it to the guy behind the counter, and guess what? The wet floor sign came out. There we go. That story encapsulates what I was saying earlier about the fact that most matting is insufficient, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, that people think that a yellow floor sign is the solution. So if you've got matting that's only a metre, then you're only going to get maybe 1 foot on it, possibly 2 feet on it, but that's definitely not going to be enough to dry most people's feet as they walk into that building. So that's a problem. Therefore, the floor beyond the matting needs to be slip resistant. Going again back to that court case, floors either need to be prevented from becoming slippery. So either that means keeping them clean and dry, or it means that they're a floor that isn't slippery when it's contaminated with water, or precluding access. If you've got your main entrance to a supermarket, you can't close that off because otherwise people can't come into the store. So, following the logic, it makes sense that we need to think about these things. Question here on YouTube. What are the best methods to protect teams in housekeeping? That's a great question because, as I said earlier, when you are cleaning, you are knowingly introducing some risk, because the majority of cleaning methods of whatever surface involve liquid. And if liquid's getting onto floors, or if liquid's going into the air and falling onto floors, that is introducing risk. So when I talk about slips, I talk about my CHIMES model: contamination, heal, individual, maintenance, environment, and surface. When we're thinking specifically about housekeeping or cleaning staff, one of the best control measures in reality is going to be under HEAL, H, which will be footwear. Because if you can provide them with the right type of slip-resistant footwear that is designed to work for the type of contamination that might be on the floor whilst they're cleaning, the amount of contamination that might be on the floor whilst they're cleaning, and is matched up to the type of flooring that they're going to be walking on whilst they're cleaning, then that is going to significantly reduce the risk. There was a study done 2 or 3 years ago with some NHS hospitals, I think about 7 hospitals, where they gave high quality slip resistant footwear to cleaning staff across these hospitals, and saw, from memory, something like a 35% reduction in incidents between the staff that had been given the highly specified slip resistant footwear and other people who had what you might call safety footwear. One of the challenges with footwear is that safety footwear doesn't necessarily mean slip resistant footwear. So footwear would be a very, very good control measure to think about for people that are cleaning, because if they are going to walk on floors that are wet or contaminated, and we can't control the floor because they could be cleaning floors that are not ever going to get wet or contaminated other than during the cleaning process. So nobody can expect there to be anti-slip floors everywhere. That's just not realistic. Then footwear is a very good control measure. We can also think about how they're cleaning from a human factors perspective and a methodology perspective. So, for example, can you start at the far end of a room and clean towards the door so that you're not you're trying not to step on any floors that are contaminated. Could you clean half of the floor and then allow that to dry and then clean the other half of the floor? There are lots of other things you can do from a methodology perspective as well to keep people away from walking upon floors that are wet or otherwise contaminated. Training as well, so making sure they understand the process that they're supposed to follow and why, and making sure they understand that slip risk exists and what they can do. Some of those steps we just mentioned about it would be another good thing as well. Probably got time for another couple of questions. If anybody's got any questions they want to ask, or if they want to give me a number of one of the pre-prepared questions as well. I'm just having a scan on the different places to see any suggestions. Somebody said number 1, so let's go for number 1. If someone slips, trips, or falls, does that mean we will need to pay out an insurance claim? So again, there's going to be a difference between slips and trips here. I mostly work around slips, and I can tell you when it comes to slips that just because somebody slips, just because a floor was wet, and just because they legitimately hurt themselves, does not mean that you will have to pay out a claim. If you are able to demonstrate and prove with evidence that you have taken the reasonable steps, and particularly, I was interviewing a lawyer called David Scott on my podcast about this, and he said, look, if we've got the up-to-date and the compliant slip test data to prove that that floor is safe when it's wet, it exceeds the HSE benchmark. Again, thinking back to what was said after the Co-op case, then we would expect to be able to defend that claim. So it's a fallacy that if someone slips, they're going to get a payout. They're entitled to make a claim if they feel as if that's justified, but it doesn't mean that the claim will be successful. What can stop that? What can stop that from being successful? Well, if you haven't got the evidence, so you may well have done everything right, but you can't prove it, or you maybe haven't done everything right in the first place. So when we work with clients on slips, we have this kind of sequential model we work through, and the last bit is it's a model with 5 A's, and the last thing is affirm, which is all about being able to prove, document, evidence what you've done. So you can do everything right, but if you can't prove you've done it, then that's going to be difficult. So you do need to have the evidence of what you've been doing throughout as well. But obviously, the first thing is you've got to do everything right. And most people, in my experience, have quite a superficial range of risk management controls in place when it comes to slips and trips. So if you haven't gone that little bit deeper, that little bit broader into understanding the risk, and you haven't taken steps to measurably, quantifiably reduce the risk, then you're going to be in a more difficult position. Good stuff. Thanks everybody for joining and for some of the great questions. Very much enjoyed this, and I'm going to be doing this every month. This Q&A session. So if you happen to see this on the replay, or if another question crops up, then you can always come and join another time round. What I'd like to do is just encourage you to, as I'm signing off, encourage you to get involved in some more of the content we're doing this month, because we are running a campaign called Sliptember. So it's all about raising awareness about slips in particular and the benefits of a proactive and a scientific approach to that. And I've spoken today, when it comes to slips, about chimes. These are the 6 key reasons why somebody might slip. And where buildings, in my experience, do well and don't have that big an issue, it's because they're doing well in these 6 areas. Conversely, where people have issues, it's because they tend not to be doing quite as well. So I'd really encourage you to use our slip prevention scorecard, which is a free tool. It takes only about 3.5 minutes to do. It's basically an online quiz. You answer some questions about your building within each of these 6 areas. And at the end of it, you get a score for your overall slip stopping ability, shall we say, but you also get a score for each of the chimes. And what that means is you start to really understand where you're doing best and where you've got some room for improvement. So having that data means you can take some informed decisions, focus on the areas that need the most help, and then you can start to drive down your risk. You can get to the scorecard at scorecard.slipsafety.co.uk, and I'd really encourage you to give that a go. Let's continue working together to drive down the risk of slips, trips, and falls in our buildings. Thanks very much for joining. I hope that's been useful, and look forward to seeing you here on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, wherever else we are, coming up soon. Thanks a lot, and take care.